everyone, and welcome to February's Florida Native Plant Society Lunch and Learn. We are really happy to have you. We have Invasive Species Awareness Week coming up starting Sunday. We're partnering with the University of Florida to post interesting posts starting Sunday. There may or may not be music, and so please keep an eye on our social media at that time. And on Thursday, we'll be featuring the invasive species hero that we pitched for, that we sent out an email and posted in the Sable Miner. So we got 24 applicants. A couple people were, nominated several times. So we're really happy to be bringing that, be celebrating that person on Thursday. And then one last thing, the next Lunch and Learn is the conservation update, which will be on March 29th. So if your chapter is working on something interesting conservation-wise, please email me or email John Benton, our conservation chair, and we will arrange that. And we have some, internal stuff that we're working on that we'd like to present to you guys about. So without further ado, I will move on to Emily. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Emily Bell. I'm the communications coordinator for the Florida Wildflower Foundation. I'm going to go ahead and try and get my screen up here. So it's coming up. I got the thumbs up from Val. Thank you. So I've been with the foundation for a little over 2 years now, but prior to that, I've did over 10 years of work on invasive species issues, both in Florida and Hawaii, for different groups like the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. I worked with our cooperative invasive species management areas. And then most recently, prior to coming to the foundation, I was an invasive species programs coordinator for UF IFAS and the Florida Invasive Species Partnership. So it's something that I have been working on for a long time. Really quick, I want to introduce the foundation as well. So if you're not familiar with what we do, we work to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitat through education, research, planting, and conservation. So our research, we support research focused around establishing native plants in urban areas, as well as increasing the availability on the market of native plants. In our planting efforts, we have a few grants. We have Viva Florida, which supplies funds for community gardens, and we have Seedlings for Schools, which provides seedlings for school wildflower gardens. The Viva Florida grant application is currently open until March 15th. I think that's right. It's on our website. And Seedlings for Schools will open soon. In the conservation aspect, we work with naturally occurring stands of wildflowers on roadsides. We do surveys in different parts of the state and work with local authorities to help protect them. Education is really a huge part of what we do, and so we produce a lot of materials and information, both on our website. We have almost 400 native plant profiles, and that's growing all the time. And we also have these types of resources to help people learn about how they can incorporate native plants in their own landscapes. A lot of what we do is funded by the state wildflower license plate. And this you can see here is our old design. We had a redesign. I think it's been many years now, so hopefully most of the tags are starting to be the newer ones that you see. So this is a tag you can get at your county DMV and help support our efforts. If you do get the tag, you are automatically a member, but we do need you to let us know. There's a form you can fill out on our website, or you can contact us and we'll get you into our membership database. So now I'm going to jump right into the subject at hand, invasive species. And really what I want to do today is just give a really kind of high-level overview of the issue and how we talk about it, and then address some of the most frequently asked questions regarding the issue. So first and foremost, what even is an invasive species? So this definition was a part of a publication that, well, this is a pretty generally accepted definition, and we use it in a publication that I was a part of at UF, led by Basil Iannone. And we did a publication called Standardizing Invasive Species Terminology for Effective Outreach and Education. So the purpose of this definition is not to resolve all the scientific debate about what we're dealing with invasive species or introduced species, but really to help us all be speaking the same language when we talk about this to the public and how we can affect change in this area. So an invasive species is one that is not native to a particular area. So that particular area part is really important because a particular area can be anything as small as a specific conservation area. It can be the state, it can be the country. So when we talk about both native and non-native, we really have to be clear about the area that we are discussing. It has been introduced by human activity, either intentionally or unintentionally. So this distinguishes species that kind of had their own natural range expansions, which we know happens at a much slower rate than the rate at which humans now in modern society move species around. So that's an important component of the definition. And it causes or is likely to cause harm. So that's kind of the clincher, right? Because we have non-native species that can become established that don't cause any problems. And so we're not as likely to manage those. Although we do need to keep an eye on them because there are times when that can change. But in general, it's that causes or is likely to cause harm part. And typically we look at harm to our environment, our economy, or human health and well-being. There's cases of species that are actually dangerous or toxic or pose a threat. And so we're concerned about those as well. Today, I'm going to focus on ecological impacts. So when we talk about economic impacts, a lot of times we're getting into agricultural pests and invasive species. I'm not going to touch on that today. I'm primarily focused on ecological impacts of invasive plants. So that's kind of be the theme. I want to bring up just really quickly some nuance here because I see a lot of times a debate going on about whether a native species can be considered invasive. So in our publication for standardizing terminology, we propose the use of the term nuisance for a native species that may need to be managed in certain settings, primarily where we have altered the habitat and given an advantage to a particular species. Vines are a really good example of this. Our smilax and our grapevines, vines are fringe species. So when we fragment habitat, we create more habitat for vines and make it easier for them to potentially outcompete or overgrow some of the things that we want to have. So that may be an instance, in which we would manage a native plant. There's also when we exclude fire from habitats like pine flatwoods, and there's hardwoods that come in. Land managers will likely manage that or reintroduce fire to manage that. So we would consider those occurrences of those species to be nuisance. Again, that's why I kind of stress that we're not looking to resolve all scientific debate with this. There's nuance to all of these definitions, but in general, for the most part, this works. A non-native species introduced by humans causing harm. And again, today we're going to focus on the environment. So I want to also bring up the invasion curve. And the reason I want to share this is really contextual because it's going to touch on some other stuff that I'm going to talk about later. So for invasion, and what this really speaks to is how we manage invasive species. So at that lower end of the curve, before it even becomes a problem, we have prevention. And we know prevention is the absolute cheapest and most effective way to deal with invasive species. So this means that before, and this is where that definition, the likely to cause harm part comes in, because there's a lot of species we know, we've seen what they've done in other parts of the world or country, and they're not here yet. And so we're like, we need to keep that out. And so we create systems to be vigilant, to make sure that we're not having those species come in. So that species would still be considered invasive, even if we don't have it yet, because we've seen the havoc it's wreaked in other places. And prevention is the most effective way. Once a small number of localized populations, so now we have an established population, which means that that keyword established means it is sustaining itself without human intervention. So humans have either intentionally or accidentally introduced something, and it has been able to then expand beyond whatever cultivation we have imposed on it, and it's now sustaining itself on its own, but we only have small localized populations. This is where we can potentially do an eradication effort. So I'm going to give a non-plant example here, but we see things like the giant African land snails that occasionally pop up in South Florida, and anytime one of those is detected, they immediately, FDACS immediately goes into eradication mode because there's only a small population known, and we can possibly eradicate it. And that's what we want to do in that case. When we have a rapid increase in distribution, we might look for containment. So if there's things that are only in one, South Florida really is the hotspot. Apologies and love to South Florida for everything that's happening down there with invasive species. But, if there's species that are only there, the people to the north of that are going to look and say, okay, how can we contain? How can we keep that from spreading? And then we get into the just widespread, it's everywhere now. And there we start looking at asset-based protection and long-term management. So some species, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, again, this curve, this curve is going to be really contextual throughout my talk. We may say, okay, well, there's this invasive species kind of surrounding this natural area that has these critically endangered plants. We have to manage it heavily here to protect that population, knowing we're not going to ever eradicate that plant from the state. But we do want to protect certain assets, so we're going to work really hard to keep it out of a certain area. And there are some species that we have under maintenance control because they have to be. This is most often done with aquatic invasives that impede transportation or things like that. So that is the invasion curve and how it relates to management. So why does this matter in Florida? This is probably not new information to anyone, but Florida is one of the most heavily impacted places in the United States. Hawaii, being an island chain, is really the first. They are kind of the king of the hill on this issue, but then it falls to us. We're pretty much second. And these are some of these examples here are kind of give you a cross section of how we're impacted, right? So on the left over here, you have Brazilian pepper coming up on a island out in the marsh, and just really, you can see, creating this dense stand that's going to outcompete and become pretty monotypic with maybe only a few species in there. So Brazilian pepper covers well over 700,000 acres in Florida, and it's expanding both northeastward and northwestward in the state. We're seeing it. We're literally watching it move, really in conjunction with mangrove ecosystems as climate changes. So that's just a really good example of one that outcompetes, colonizes, and creates these dense monocultures. Kogan grass in the middle, Imperatus cylindrica. This also displaces native vegetation, but where this gets really bad is in our longleaf pine savannas, where it comes in, and so not only does it displace the native vegetation that is typically very biodiverse, so you lose biodiversity there, but it also really alters fire regimes, because our native grasses and wildflowers that grow in these pine savannas are light. Wiregrass is light. And so, but Kogan grass is very heavy and has a lot of fuel load. And in the winter, when it goes dormant and it's brown and dry, you get a very fast and hot fire. And so it alters the way the fire interacts with that ecosystem. And then, of course, hydrilla, and you can see here, it is just totally clogging up this waterway. And this is that example I mentioned where basically the Army Corps and FWC, there's areas where they are going to have to be treating for hydrilla in perpetuity. But we also know that in areas where we have it under really good maintenance control, it's better to be doing those small maintenance control treatments than to let it recolonize and have to do major treatments. It's both better ecologically and it's better economically. So you can see there's just so many ways that our ecology is impacted. So what are the plants that are invasive in Florida? I'm not going to go through a list. I'm going to share the most extensive list that we have. And again, this is ecology based. You could go into agriculture and they may have a whole nother list. There's some overlap, but there's some things that aren't going to be here that would be there. But the Florida Invasive Species Council, formerly FLEPC, the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council, so it's for forever and ever, it was called the FLEPC list. Now it's the FISC list. They maintain a non-regulatory list. It's compiled by a group of botanical and natural resource experts in Florida. And it currently has 81 Category 1 species and 85 Category 2s. So you can see here, a Category 1 is a species that is definitely altering native plant communities. It's creating problems. A Category 2 species is one that is established, and these experts have seen it increasing in abundance and frequency, but maybe they haven't quite seen the impacts yet. So they're watching it. And a Category 2 can absolutely become a Category 1 when they start to see those impacts. So this is really the list to go to. And if you view it online, and I'll share some links in the end, if you view it online, it gives you some good information about which ones are still available in the trade, which ones are regulated, and things like that. Which leads into what we're going to talk about next. So how are invasive plants regulated? There are essentially two regulatory mechanisms for plants. There is a federal noxious weed list, which prohibits the foreign and domestic movement of any living plant material of any plants on the list. And there are a lot of plants present in Florida that are on the federal noxious weed list. Kogan grass, hydrilla, and a handful of others. So there is some overlap, and there's also some that aren't present in Florida. And then in Florida, we have both a noxious weed list and a prohibited aquatic plant list. Historically, the noxious weed list, well, for a longer time, I don't know if forever, but the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services oversaw the federal noxious weed list, and DEP oversaw the Florida prohibited aquatic plant list. But in more recent years, I think around 2019 or 2020, the Florida prohibited aquatic plant list was shifted to be overseen by FDEX as well, which really makes sense. It consolidates the regulatory authority and probably reduces some of the redundancies there. So the Florida noxious weed list is very similar to the federal. It regulates introduction, possession, and transport of plants on those lists. The prohibited aquatic plant list is a little different. It has class 1 species, which really have the same restrictions as the noxious weed list, but it also has class 2 species, which are species that can be grown in the state. That must be permitted, but can only be sold outside the state. So this is likely has a lot to do with the aquarium industry and things like that, where there's economically viable species that can be grown here, but I'm sure that there are, in the permitting process, there has to be measures for containment and things like that for these class 2 species. So by far, the biggest question I've gotten across my entire career working on invasive plants in Florida is, why can I still buy some of them why can I go to the nursery and buy some of these? So pictured here are some of my top 3 kind of, most frustrating that you can still just go and buy these, right? So here's Lantana striga chimera, and this picture was taken in a beach dune. This isn't in someone's yard. This is, what happens when it escapes, and it's just, really starting to spread in this beach dune. The asparagus fern actually is in the same location in the same beach dune. And then you have Mexican petunia, which there's some really compelling images from Gainesville area of it just kind of colonizing an understory. So, but as you know, we could all walk into a store today and purchase these and plant them in our yards. Most people, when they ask this question, are saying, you know, why is this allowed? Why isn't this regulated? So the thing is, we are not going to regulate ourselves out of Florida's invasive species problem. And there's a number of reasons for that. It's kind of a complex issue. So I'm going to tackle it in two ways. First, I'm going to talk about how we do get a plant regulated. So the primary way for plants to be banned or removed from sale would be regulation. The federal noxious weed list is a bear. It's an extremely slow moving process. And I would also argue the primary impetus for addition is economic. So really federal plants or federally listed plants or getting new plants listed are going to have to demonstrate major economic impact. And that's reasonable to a degree. I mean, yes, we wish that ecological impacts would rank at the same level, but there are reasons that they are looking at the economics of it as well. So really, we're not here in Florida. That's not a super viable option if you want to get something off the market. The state noxious weed list, however, it's actually not that complicated to petition adding a species to the state noxious weed list. It's relatively straightforward. And in fact, the UF IFAS assessment, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, has in the last 5 years or so petitioned and successfully had a number of species added to the Florida noxious weed list. This includes beech vitex, Vitex rotundifolia, Japanese honeysuckle, Lonicera japonica, Callery pear, Pyrus calleriana, and camphor tree, Cinnamomum camphora. So they have been successful in that primarily by demonstrating a relatively early stage in that invasion curve, closer to containment than widespread, just everywhere. So anyone can petition for a species to be listed. However, the species that are most likely to succeed in getting listed are those that you can demonstrate an ability to effectively contain or potentially eradicate from localized areas, or the state. So these three here in these images, they're not going to get listed, not just because they're so widespread. There's also economics to consider, but we're not going to eradicate them from the state, and we don't have the political will or capital to put the effort in that the money and the cost it would take to do so, or to even really beat them back to a reasonable level. So they're really looking at that now as one of the factors for listing. And of course, there are species already listed that are widespread, like Brazilian pepper and things like that. So, but now for newer additions, that's really a big emphasis. So unfortunately, many of the invasive plants you can purchase in the landscape industry still today are already pretty widespread and wouldn't be viable candidates. The ones that have been recently listed, though, are important to note because up until they became listed, you could purchase them. So those are good examples of, getting some of those off the market. It's also really important to consider that horticulture is a major economic driver in Florida. We are one of the largest kind of green industry hubs in the country, along with California and Texas. We're growing a lot of the country's plants and we're moving a lot of the country's plants. So this often, unfortunately, puts us in conflict with horticulture because they are growing and selling some of these plants, but we have to figure out ways to work with them more than against them, and it's really, really challenging. But ultimately, the most important and impactful thing we can do is change consumer habits, starting with ourselves. So having these plants become less economically profitable is really going to be the biggest factor in having them become less prevalent and less widely available. And then we can get into cultivars and all of that, and we'll take questions in a moment. So if you want to talk more about that, we can. But it's a whole nother can of worms, if you will. So some additional resources to share. These are kind of my key recommendations for like, okay, what now? You know, I've given you the list, and actually, Val, I guess because this is on YouTube, the chat box won't go to people who are in this. Is that right? Sorry, you're muted. I'm asking. Okay. So we have, I think you just saw that. This presentation basically has a companion article on our website. And let me see if I can even find my chat box. Let me give that link to Val. Oh, here we go. Found it. Okay. And I'll have her pop that in. So all of the things I talked about in these slides, if you go to this article on our website, it kind of goes in the same order, and there's links to the FISC list, the regulatory lists, and all of that. And there's links to these resources as well. So Florida has 16 cooperative invasive species management areas. We call them SISMAs for short. And essentially these are regional working groups that incorporate all of the different folks primarily who manage the natural areas in your region. Can include city and county folks, and you can be in your SISMA. If you go to this website, you can scroll down and find contact information and reach out to them. They're a great resource for if you have questions about what is problematic in your own region, if you want to get involved. It would be really great to see more, you know, general kind of public / interested individuals / homeowners who are kind of working on these issues in their own landscapes, getting involved in these groups. The UF Center for Aquatic and Invasive Species has a really extensive plant directory. And so I will say about this plant directory, it includes native plants too, but those profiles are not very extensive. There's not that much information there. However, the invasive plant profiles do typically have a lot of information. In fact, before I left UF, I was working on updating many of those. So hopefully they're even more useful now. But essentially, I use it in conjunction with like the FISC list. You know, I'll go to the list and I'll say, okay, I don't know much about this plant. Let me go see what the center's directory profile has to say about it. So that's a great resource just for learning more and better understanding. They also are the place for management information as well. The UF IFAS assessment of non-native plants in Florida's natural areas is a data-driven tool to assess both plants that are already in Florida's natural areas for invasive potential or whether they're invasive or not, but they also have a predictive tool. So they're looking at that prevention part. They're looking at, okay, here's some plants that people are likely going to want to introduce. You know, does it look like something that would be an issue for Florida? And if so, how do we want to address that? The IFAS assessment tool is actually within the University of Florida system. If a plant is listed as invasive or high risk, it should not be recommended by anyone within UF IFAS. So sometimes there's discrepancies there, and it's always good to be familiar with that tool so that you can kind of you know, double check and sometimes communicate with UF IFAS folks if you see any discrepancies. The Atlas of Florida Plants is something you guys are probably all super familiar with. I visit that website every single day. It's great for distribution of plants, both native and non-native plants that are established outside of cultivation. So if it's a non-native plant that's been vouchered in a natural area, it's going to show up in the Atlas. So it's a great tool to look at for where these things might be. And then, of course, I should have included this here, but EDDMaps, EDDM IFAS EdMaps, you can download an app where you can actually report invasive species online, and they pull in data from INAT as well, so you can use iNaturalist in a similar way. And EdMaps and INAT are helping us also better understand where these species are in the state and how they're moving in the state. And then the last resource I've included here, CABI, the Invasive Species Compendium. CABI is an international organization, but the reason I include it is because they also have plant profiles, and they are so extensive and well researched, and they have and they cite all their sources. So especially for some of those ones that are worldwide weeds like lantana and probably Brazilian pepper. I'm trying to think. I've looked at CABI a lot. So there's a number of species we're dealing with in Florida that they have really extensive profiles on, and it can just be really helpful to learn more. So that is all I have for you guys today, and I'm happy to kind of take some questions and see what you're curious about. Oh, I also wanted to mention, sorry, let me go to my last slide. As Valerie said in the beginning, next week is National Invasive Species Awareness Week. So we will be doing our Plant This, Not That series on social media, which will focus on plants that are still available in the nursery trade and some native alternatives to those plants. We are also working on updating our kind of invasives landing page on our website, so we'll be sharing that as well. So be sure to follow us. We're pretty much everywhere as FLA Wildflowers on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn as well.
That was great. Thank you so much, Emily.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So one of the things, thank you for your presentation. We want to just, we've got lots of people watching today. So a request from anybody that's watching right now, if you've got any questions for Emily or myself or Valerie about invasive plants, please go ahead and enter them into the chat right now. We did have somebody that asked what the name of the plant featured next to the Brazilian pepper on one of your slides was. I think the label was for the photographer. Somebody else has come back and said it was Kogan grass, but if you could just confirm that.
Correct, yes. So this is these three images. This is Brazilian pepper. Or can you see my cursor? This is Brazilian pepper here. This is Kogan grass in flower. And that's an interesting one because in some parts of the state, they see that Kogan grass seed is viable. In other parts of the state, it's not. It's really interesting, but it spreads through rhizomes just through these systems like this. So yes, that's Kogan grass and that's Hydrilla.
Great, thank you. And so somebody else says, Barb says, sometimes natives meet all the criteria for invasive other than being native. The example is buttonwoods are taking over Sanibel. Somebody else says, before we add more buttonwood to our conduit community, I'd like to hear more about the buttonwood problem in Sanibel. I don't know if you have anything you can add about buttonwood. I mean, it is native, and we've obviously covered off a little bit about the sort of nuisance comment, but if you could.
Unfortunately, I don't know about that specific issue, but I will elaborate on how important that is, because as we alter habitats, we do select, and not just in plants, in animals as well. We kind of create things to be more hospitable for certain species, and that can create an imbalance. And I do hear frequently from land managers who get pushback when they try to manage plants that are native but are not, but are kind of impacting the ecosystems they're trying to protect. So I would just say, I wish I could speak more directly to buttonwood. It sounds kind of similar maybe to tie in West Florida, where that's another one that can become just really dense thickets in areas that are fire suppressed, or and so it can start impacting like an open, a wet prairie where they're trying to, sustain that habitat. So I would encourage everyone, when you see things like that, to learn more about it and talk to the land managers, because more often than not, they want to share with you what they're doing and why they're doing it. I think there's often this disconnect, especially with departmental folks like FWC and DEP and the water management districts. But I've spent my career working with those folks who are out in the field on the ground, and they really want people to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. So, don't just like have a reactionary, like, oh my gosh, that's native. What are you doing? Like inform yourself and learn a little bit more and see, what the issues are. There's, that's also why the natives that we plant matter, because we're increasing some of the really popular natives. We're increasing the propagule pressure, so the amount of the plant and seed material that's available in that area. And that's why we really, it's really important to think about regional appropriateness and what kind of habitats are closest to you that you may be impacting, especially if you're near a natural area. So sorry, that was kind of long and soapboxy, but it is. And that's so early on when I said with our definitions, we tend to use the term nuisance, and a native nuisance species may very well need to be managed. And yes, they do meet a lot of the criteria for that term invasive. And there's a lot of debate internally in the field about that. Like, can we call a native species invasive? And for us and for our terminology publication, we just really want everyone speaking the same language because we want people to understand. So that's kind of one of our priorities with that.
Yeah, no, agreed. And FMPS certainly takes the same approach to that as well. Actually, somebody from the Miami-Dade IFAS Extension has said we do need to plant the right native in the right place. So yeah, right plant, right place is certainly something we're all paying attention to. TD Graham says we're trying to restore gopher tortoise habitat that has extensive Congo grass, frostweed and grape overgrowth. We have cleared with hand labor. Oof, hard work. What kind of spray regime could we use to maintain that?
Great question. So I can't rattle off the exact regime, but what I can tell you is that the UF IFAS Center for Aquatic and Invasive Species has really great research on kogan grass. So I would say go to EDIS, go to their publications. I'm pretty sure they have one specific to kogan grass that outlines like best management. If not, reach out to them directly and tell them what you're doing. And they can probably give you some site-specific examples. But kogan grass is one that we do know how to reduce the populations of kogan grass using mowing, herbicide, and in conjunction with each other. That is one that has been extensively researched and people have successfully kind of reined in. So the resource I would look to there is the center, and they have a lot of really good information.
Yeah, and presumably right time of year, and
yes, exactly. There's certain times of the year to do things, and retreatment intervals and things like that, and they know that one pretty well. So
okay, great. Thanks. Sandra asks, if you were to list the top 5 invasives in Florida, what would you include on the list?
That's such a hard question, and it's another one I get a lot. So Brazilian pepper for me kind of is a top one, really because it covers so much area already, and because it is expanding in its range in Florida with climate change. Lygodium microphyllum, old world climbing fern in South Florida, another one that is expanding in its range. Kogan grass, so that's 3. It can be so site specific as well, because I tend to take this broader view and look at the ones that are really just like taking over areas. Coral ardesia is another one. I mean, gosh, just the way it is becoming so dense in some of our hardwood hammocks throughout North Central Florida is just so hard to kind of watch and see happening, and it's super hard to control. But there are other species that may be like an early detection rapid response risk, or that may be directly impacting a very small endangered species population, that you would rank high too. So it really depends on what your criteria is as well.
Yeah, we've got our palmetto that's about to come out in the next, it'll reach all our members in the next couple of weeks. We have an article in there that's about water hyacinth.
Yeah. I mean, some of the aquatics are so, because again, they're super hard to control, and they impede, they not only change the habitat, but they're impeding transport and our ability to, recreate in those areas. So unfortunately in Florida, we just have so many, and that doesn't get into animals, which is again, another can of worms.
Yeah, definitely. So let's see. There's a question. Somebody says, I've used INAT. I've got one to document invasives, and now there's EDD maps. Is there anyone who directly fights individual outbreaks? So I guess if you've reported anything,
yeah.
Sorry?
No. A few points there. I've got one, and EdMaps are the same database. So Florida has its own EdMaps app, which is I've got one. So actually, I appreciate that clarification. EdMaps was created by UGA. It's an incredible program, and Florida was kind of one of the first areas where it really was kind of a pilot spot for it. So the I've got one app, it is EdMaps for Florida. So if you do download the app, that's a perfect one to use. So it depends. There have absolutely been cases where things have popped up in either EdMaps or INAT where there has been an early detection and rapid response to them. So for examples I can name specifically are when I worked in St. Johns County for DEP, I was in that CISMA, that Cooperative Invasive Species Management area, and we had beach vitex that popped up and was reported, and we had like old world climbing fern, like Godium microphyllum, that popped up and was reported. And the CISMA sprang into action and started managing those populations because those were small isolated spots. If it's something that's regulatory, so EdMaps, the reason it's good to one of the reasons it's good to use I've got one over INAT is because I've got one does have local verifiers. So when you put something in, there are people often associated with the CISMA that will review that account and kind of verify it. Similar to EdMaps, but specifically for invasive species, right? So that's one way to know that there is somebody who's seeing it who may likely know, like, oh, this is a new record of something that we need to get on top of. And that does happen. Alternatively, for things that are already widespread, I go back again to the invasion curve. If it's, something that's already widespread, it's unlikely someone's going to take action on it, but it's still really important for us to know where these things are and how they're moving.
Great, thank you. So Donald asks, and this might be something that Val can speak to as well here, which is, are there any posters or such that we could share on social media or spread the word this coming week? So during National Invasive Species Awareness Week. And I know, Valerie, we've got some materials coming out, and obviously you've mentioned that as well, but any posters or anything else that's sort of more substantial?
So yeah, I would say, follow FMPS and share what they post. Please follow us and share what we post. A lot of Florida organizations are probably going to be sharing some good information. Check and see if your regional CISMA is on socials. They likely will share some things. But NISA, I think it's just nisa.org, the website, also has some graphics and things that you can download and share. They have they're more broad because they're national, but they have a whole toolkit and, some really nice graphics and information you can share as well. Also, the Center for, if you're not following the Center for UF IFAS Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants, they also have some really nice, graphics that they've posted. I mean, I would say scroll through and find, they've got some really great species profiles and things like that. Share. Yeah. That's
Great. That's excellent. I spent a very lot of money removing an Australian pine from my house, so yeah, particular affinity to that one. So Adam asks, also, are there any laws in place or proposed that deal with invasives in public right-of-ways or private conservation easements? What options are available to get access and resources for removal? Yeah, and I mean, we get this question a lot as well about, you know, requiring big box stores to remove the sale of invasives. You know, there's an awful lot of conversation about this in terms of laws and the legalities.
Yeah, that is a really difficult one. And as far as I know, there's no specific regulations saying, you know, like for DOT, like if this shows up on your right of way, you're legally required to remove it. You know, one thing we absolutely do need to push for, and the Western states have a much more robust program around this, is decontamination of equipment. So one of the primary ways these things are moving on roadways, and we see it directly all the time, and this isn't just you know, public agencies, this is companies, contractors as well, you know, mowers and all that kind of equipment that's going through these areas. It would be really great to have some actual teeth behind some decontamination standards. But one thing I wanted to mention, I'm kind of glad we got this question again, along the lines of, you know, my whole soapbox about how we're not going to regulate ourselves out of this. One of the key challenges with those regulations is enforcement. And again, we simply don't have the capacity or political will to put in place the capacity to enforce increased regulation. I wish we did, and I'm not saying we shouldn't try for it, but I'm saying right now we don't. And it would take a lot, because the economic resources it would take to really go into, and I want to say Florida already expends a lot of economic resources. I mean, what FWC puts into it, what other agencies who are managing them puts into it. It's not like we're not doing anything, but we currently don't have the political will or capacity to enforce increased regulation either.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can speak a little bit to the private conservation easements and the requirements around that, which is to say that, you know, whenever a conservation easement agreement is entered into, there are commitments that a landowner might make, but again, enforcing those aren't, you know, is very difficult. And to be frank, most private landowners will avoid making a commitment to remove invasives or tackle it because of the cost involved. And so that is something that, you know, could be.
I mentioned that if you are a private landowner that has more than 5 acres and is managing natural area, FWC does have a private lands program, and they can offer some assistance. Again, they can't come out and treat all your invasives, but they do site visits. They can help you create a management plan. They can talk to you about things like if you have a coven grass infestation, they can talk to you about how to handle it. They can't come in and handle it for you, but they certainly, it's a really great program, and the people who do it are like super passionate and wonderful to work with. So it's worth exploring if you are in that situation.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. We've got a few more questions, so I'll try and I know we're getting sort of close to the end, but Susie asks, is it true that invasives do more damage to the environment than building construction? And how can we combat, oh, this is two separate parts. How can we combat Carolina willow?
So Carolina willow is, if it's the species I'm thinking of, Salix caroliniana is native. So again, that would be and it is an example of one that can become a thicket and may need to be managed. So that's not an unreasonable question. And I would also send you to the Center for Aquatic and Invasives. They're going to be the people who would have that information on best practices and like what specific herbicides might work for that plant, or, you know, cutting or anything like that. What was the first part of that question?
Do invasives do more damage than building construction? I don't know about the data on that.
Yeah, I don't know how you would quantify that, or if anyone has specifically quantified that ecologically. I mean, it's so different, right? Development is completely, there's nothing, you know, we're taking away the natural environment completely in a lot of circumstances. And invasive species are working themselves into those natural areas. So yeah, I honestly don't have a good answer on how to compare them. They're both bad.
Yeah.
They're both having big impacts, and they both are things that we need to address smartly.
So this is a kind of an interesting question, and I don't know if we'll be able to answer this, but Paul says we live in Southwest Florida in an area where ecology and the ecosystem has changed significantly. They drain the swamp, he says, of course. So he says, should we seek out natives from other ecosystems that would thrive in our changed ecosystem? And I mean, this is going to speak to, there's all sorts of conversations about this, even in terms of climate change, you know, and then how those natural systems are adjusting over time, let alone the impact that we're having with on our ecosystems as well.
So my 2 cents on that would be in agreement with you. I mean, we're having these conversations around climate change, right? Because we need to understand how plants, communities are changing, and what impacts that has all the way up the system, and how that plays in with conservation and how we try to protect certain things. I would say it would make sense to, you know, going back to right plant, right place, you know, Florida has drained a lot of its swamps, and you probably can't turn your yard back into a swamp if it initially was, but you can still find natives that would have been present in your upland areas, your drier areas in your region, and that's what I would go for. Because yeah, you can't turn it all the way back, but I'm sure I'm sure some of it was all swamp, but you know, I would say get as close as you can to what is there now and kind of what would be there in the habitat that's suitable to what you have. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I think last question, unfortunately, because we are getting to the end, which is a good one. Someone says, any good career options for people who want to get dirty and fight invasives directly?
Yeah, so there are, you know, you can start out if you're just starting out, and this is a challenge for me because I totally understand that not everyone can do this, but AmeriCorps has volunteer/internship opportunities. I don't know what the funding is like for those, but AmeriCorps puts people on the ground doing invasives work in natural areas in Florida. And then, you know, land managers, so the Water Management District, DEP, primarily through state parks, FWC, all have, you know, land management positions that are doing invasive plant stuff, or invasive species stuff. If you're in South Florida, even more so, those positions do come open. I'm trying to think of a good, like, one-stop shop to find those. If you go to the Florida Invasive Species Council website, which I think we said earlier, it's floridainvasives.org, right? You can sign up for their mailing list, and oftentimes land managers will distribute job openings through there, but you can also go to People First. I mean, most of the positions I'm aware of come through the agencies. So you can go to People First and look for kind of land management positions, and sometimes there'll be ones specific to invasives. There are certainly some companies out there that do contract work. I'm not as familiar with all of them, but you can look for that as well.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much. We have lots of other lovely comments and some interesting chat on our YouTube channel. So if people are still in there, we'll attempt to go back in and answer things there. But yeah, Emily, thank you so much for your time today. You know, I think the partnership between FMPS and Florida Wildflower Foundation is fantastic. We work, just so everybody from the, you know, that's watching knows, we work really closely and have other events that are coming up and field trips that we plan together. So yeah, I think we're all working for the same aim, which is fantastic.
Absolutely, yeah, and just thank you so much for having me, and to everyone who listened in today. And I want to echo that as well, Linda. And you know, FMPS is one of our key partners, and we're just so thrilled to be working together in every capacity that we do.
Great, thank you.
Us too. All right, everyone have an excellent weekend.